Hello, this presentation is part of the Celebration of Our Mountains Useful Plant series, and this edition is from the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens at the University of Texas at El Paso. This presentation is brought to you by Southwest University and also the Tom Lea Institute as part of Tom Lea Month. Enjoy! Remember, safety first. Not all plants are safe to use. Many plants are poisonous or have poisonous lookalikes. So before you use any plants, make sure to confirm your ID of the plant with an expert or a plant book or two plant books. For example, these beans shown here, which I'll talk about later, are deadly poison. The first plant I'll talk about is a tree, and this is at the entrance to the Chihuahuan Desert Gardens off of University. And this tree, you can see there's several photos here. Top left is an overall of the tree, and then on the right are photos of the bark and some of the leaves. And then up top, those are some of the beans from this tree. The mesquite tree is a very useful plant. All parts of the plant are edible, except of course the wood and the outer bark. But otherwise the leaves, the flowers, the beans, even the inner bark are all edible. I've had many different things made from the beans. The beans are quite sweet, although I tried them today and they were a little sour and bitter from this particular tree. Many things can be made from the beans. Cookies, bread, even a type of drink can be made from the beans. I've had the fried flowers. You dip them in beer batter. It's delicious. The leaves aren't that tasty. They basically taste like leaves. And of course, people use mesquite wood to barbecue for that distinct mesquite flavor. Just inside the entrance to the Chihuahuan Desert Garden by the trash can that you can see here in the photo on the left is cenizo or barometer bush. This bush likes to flower when the barometric pressure changes, so usually after a rainstorm passes. So some people call it rain bush as well. And you can see this one has flowers on it, purple flowers. There are actually, I think, 7 varieties of cenizo in the Chihuahuan Desert Garden or on the edge of the Chihuahuan Desert Garden. This plant can be used for colds. The leaves and the flowers can be made into a tea to treat cold and flu symptoms. Just behind the last plant, which you can see actually in the photo on the left, is an alligator juniper tree. Alligator juniper trees are rare in the El Paso area. I've seen them wild maybe once in the Franklin Mountains, and then I've seen several of them to the north in the Oregon Mountains or west in the East Potrillo Mountains. In the middle, you can see a close-up of some of the scaly leaves, and then on the right, you can see some of the alligator bark, which gives this tree its name, alligator juniper. The leaves of this plant and the bark are high in tannic acid, and so they should not be consumed, but you can make a poultice or an external use wash for sunburn, for acne, for stinky feet and armpits. So tannic acid is still useful even though it should not be consumed. Also, the berries of this tree, I believe they're called cones technically, but I call them berries, juniper berries. These berries are very tasty and edible. You can find them on the ground and eat them off the ground. Off the tree, they're still a little too bitter. I could not find any berries on the ground under this tree today. This next plant, globe mallow, is a common weed in the El Paso region. Maybe you recognize it. These are my favorite flowers in the El Paso region because of the beautiful orange color. This plant grows most anywhere with very little water. This particular individual has gotten some good water, so it's quite tall. Globe mallows are the cousins of marshmallow. Marshmallow is a plant, believe it or not, and marshmallow and globe mallow and several of the other mallows have a substance in them called mucilage, which is very good for sore throats, or if inhaled, is good for sore nasal passages and stuff like that. So a tea made from the leaves of this plant is good for sore throats or sore nasal passages. The next plant is another mesquite tree. This one's Tornillo, or screwbean mesquite. It got its name from the shapes of the fruits, which you can see in the photo on the far right, and maybe you can see them in the photo in the middle. On the left, that photo shows you where the tree is in the Chihuahuan Desert Garden. As with the other mesquites, all parts of this plant are edible, although there's not as much flesh on these beans, and often when you find them, they've already been raided by insects. You'll see holes that are drilled into the sides of the screw beans. So all parts edible: leaves, flowers, inner bark, and the screw bean fruits. The photo on the left shows two different Sapphira plants. Sapphira is also known as Texas mountain laurel, and there are several species. The top middle photo is sort of a close-up of the leaves, and then at the bottom right is a fresh bean, a bean that's a year, maybe 2 years old, and then on the far right are some seeds from several years ago. So as this shows the process of the beans decaying over time. This is not a useful plant unless, of course, you would like to dye those red beans. In half of the red seed coat, there is enough poison to kill a full-grown person. The Apache, though, oddly enough, would swallow these red beans for a quote-unquote spiritual experience. I do not recommend that you consume or use this plant for anything, but when it's flowering, it has beautiful bunches of purple flowers, and the flowers smell like grape soda, which is pretty awesome. As you continue to move through the Chihuahuan Desert Garden, there's a small pond area, and growing next to that small pond are cattails. And you can see the pond area in my terrible photo on the left, and then a close-up photo of the cattails with their characteristic brown hot dog shaped flowers. Those are actually the female flowers. The male flowers are much smaller and pretty much gone by now. Cattail pollen is edible. Some people collect the pollen from the male flowers. Also, I've had the roasted immature female flowers, so before they get brown and fuzzy and dry, those little brown hot dog things are yummy if you roast them over a fire. Also, the young shoots of this plant and the inner part of the shoots are edible. I like to pick them and roast them over a fire. Lastly, the rhizomes, or the horizontal roots that are down inside of the mud beneath this plant, those rhizomes are also edible, and I've roasted them many times. And you peel off the outer part, the dirty part of the rhizome, and consume the starchy inner part, very much like potatoes, but if you ask me, more tasty. This plant also, not that this is a concern in the Chihuahuan Desert, but this plant is also very easy to identify as a winter forage, a plant that you can find and eat in the snow. Again, not a worry here in El Paso. The next plant that's useful is grasses, and I've shown some photos here of grasses in the desert garden. All grasses are edible, every single species of grass. Some of them are more palatable and easier to harvest. These desert grasses have a lot of dead foliage around them, and it takes a lot of work to get some good food out of them. You know grass because corn is a grass. The seeds of a grass are corn. Also, wheat is a grass. So those are two grasses that we commonly eat. The only caution with eating grasses is that if you tear the leaves off of a plant and eat them, which isn't very tasty, but if you're desperate, you're desperate. If you tear the leaves off a plant, that plant will start to produce cyanogenic compounds as a defense, cyanides. And so you should never browse off a plant that you have already browsed off of. So grasses are very common around the world and a very useful plant. The next plant is a tree. This is a pine tree. I think this might be a piñón pine, but I don't really know. On the left is a picture of the tree, and then on the right is a close-up of the pine needles. Most pines have edible seeds called pine nuts. Some of them are quite small and really not worth the work to get out of the pine cones and then also shell them. But the piñón pines have nice, big, pudgy seeds, and they are definitely worth the work of getting out of the pine cones and then shelling them afterwards. Pines also, their needles and their bark are full of tannic acid or tannins like the juniper trees. And so a external wash can be made. So kind of like a tea for the outside of your body, an external wash can be made from the dried needles, the fresh needles, or even the bark or downed wood. And this tannin-rich tea can be used to treat scrapes or sunburn or acne or, in my case, stinky feet. When I took my walk through the garden today, I was introduced to this plant for the first time. This is Baja Red, a beautiful vine that's flowering like crazy right now. This is actually native to Baja California, so to the southwest of El Paso. I didn't know what this plant was used for, and so I looked it up. I Googled the name and Googled the uses. And this is important for me to mention because nobody knows all the plants. Nobody knows what they're all used for. We are all students. We're all still learning, and I will never ever run out of plants to learn. This particular plant, the foliage, is used as a tea to treat flu symptoms and also to treat menstrual cramps. The seeds were roasted by Native Americans that were native to Baja, and those roasted seeds pop open like popcorn and reveal a whitish meal, just like popcorn. Very cool plant and very beautiful. Next plant is narrowleaf yucca. There are several species of yucca that grow in or around El Paso, but this particular yucca is the most common yucca out in the desert around El Paso. Yuccas are different from agaves because yuccas flower every year, and you can see last year's flower stalk sticking up out of this plant. The flowers that grow on that stalk are whitish and are very tasty. They're all edible on all species of yucca. They taste kind of like a sweet cabbage, and they're one of my favorite edibles. Remember though, they're food for the yucca moth, and so the yucca moth only eats the pollen from these particular flowers, so you don't want to pick all the flowers. But they're a great addition to a salad or something like that. The fibrous leaves and the fibers in the leaves are very useful and were used by Native Americans for all sorts of stuff. In fact, there are shoes at the sandals at the Archaeology Museum of El Paso made from the leaves of this plant. Also, yuccas have another common name, the soap tree, and that's because the outer part of the root is very rich in saponins, and saponins, of course, are natural soaps. And so when the colonizers came through the area, the Native Americans showed them this plant so that they could wash themselves because they probably smelled really bad. This next plant, which I did have trouble getting a good photo of, is fairy duster or Calliandra. And this plant's actually not a useful plant, but it was just so beautiful and it's flowering right now, and so I thought I would include it in this presentation. If you look closely at this plant, it has several features that are common in desert plants. These very small, greatly divided leaves, and then these greatly reduced flowers, which really have no petals or sepals. So that pink fuzzy mess is all stamens, which usually are not that large on flowers, but these flowers are basically all stamens. Again, not a useful plant, but I had to include it because it's so beautiful and it's currently flowering. This next plant is a Yucca look-alike. This is Sotol. Sotol can be distinguished from Yucca usually because they're shorter and the flower stalk is quite different, although there is no flower stalk on this plant or any in the Chihuahuan Desert Garden for that matter. The leaves of this plant are also fibrous, but not as good as the yuccas. I've seen shelters and floor mats made from these leaves of this plant. The leaves of Sotol are also toothed. They have teeth on them, which is how you can tell them apart from a yucca. Sotol's not that useful of a plant other than in Mexico they make an alcohol from it. They cut off all the leaves and chop open the heart of this plant and extract the plant juice, the plant sap, if you will, and then they ferment that to make an alcoholic drink called Sotol. Remember, alcohol isn't just useful for a buzz or whatever. Alcohol can be used as a disinfectant to treat wounds and injuries and other skin conditions. And Native Americans did make and use alcohol for medicinal purposes. This next bush is rain bush or creosote bush or gobernadora. This is one of the most powerful medicines in the Chihuahuan Desert and is a plant to be respected and treated with caution. On the left, you can see a photo of the bush at the base of the tree, kind of in the middle. And then on the right, I tried to get a close-up of some of the fuzzy fruits and the yellow flowers. So look closely. This bush, the crushed leaves of the bush are a very powerful bug repellent. You just grind up some of the leaves and smear that green stuff on your skin, and most, if not all, bugs flee from this plant. There's chemicals in this plant that actually turn bug blood to jello, and so the bugs freak out and fly away. It's just pretty cool. It can be used as a internal medicine to treat diarrhea, but this comes with a very, very stern warning. You should only use 2 or 3 of the tiny, tiny leaves for an entire cup of tea, and you should only steep them for about a minute. I myself once used this plant to treat diarrhea, and I used too much of the plant, and after 4 or 5 days of not being able to use the restroom, I had to go to Walgreens and buy X-Lax in order to counter the effects of this plant. So it is not a plant to be messed with. It should be treated with respect. Currently, it is being researched because there are hundreds of biologically active chemicals in this plant. Researchers at NMSU, in fact, are researching the uses of the creosote bush or the rain bush. Also, it's great to put a branch of it in the shower. Yeah, it drops leaves all over the floor and stuff, but every time you shower, you smell the El Paso rain. Standing over top of the last plant is this tree, the desert willow, also called mimbres in Spanish. This tree is common in arroyos throughout the Chihuahuan Desert and also is a popular landscaping plant in the El Paso region. This is not a true willow. Willow trees are actually the source of aspirin, of salicylic acid, it's called. This plant does not have salicylic acid. It's not actually in the willow family, but the leaves resemble a willow. The mimbres, leaves, and the flowers can be made into a tea that can be used to treat cold and flu symptoms. And on the right in the photo, you can see some of the beans of this desert willow plant, the long, narrow things. Again, these are not flowering anymore, although they flower for much of the year, but I couldn't find any of the beautiful pink flowers on this particular tree. This next plant is another common landscaping plant in the El Paso region, and this particular individual was tough for me to find in the Chihuahuan Desert Garden. It's much easier to find larger examples of this plant in the landscaping over by the Student Union building at UTEP. It's called desert trumpet or yellow bells, but normally people call it Tacoma stands. And the leaves and flowers of this plant, again, can be used to treat cold and flu symptoms, just a tea of the leaves and flowers. This next plant is beneath the Bhutanese prayer wheel that you can see in the photo on the left. And this is a member of the nightshade family, actually. And most of the nightshades are deadly poison, except for tomatoes and potatoes, and of course this plant, wolfberry, also known as goji berry. You may have heard of goji berries. These are a superfood. They're small little red berries that grow all over this bush. And they're, I think, one of the foods with the highest amount of antioxidant of anything, up there with pomegranates. So a very nutritious, very, very yummy sour berry on this bush. Otherwise, the leaves and the branches are toxic on this plant. The next plant is Ocotillo, sometimes called coach whip or living fence. It looks like a cactus because of all the thorns, but it's actually not a cactus. These will shoot out leaves along their stems after a rain usually. And on the right you can see a photo of the base and of course the sign. Ocotillo flowers, which are red, and the roots can be used to treat muscle aches. I've actually gone out and collected hundreds of the red flowers off the ground and then made a bathtub soak out of the flowers to test this out. And it definitely works as a muscle relaxer to soothe sore muscles after a long hike. If you look at the photo on the right, you can see a small cactus growing under this ocotillo. I'm about to talk about that cactus in the next slide. Barrel cactuses are one of the largest cacti in our region, if not the largest. You have to go quite a ways out up the mountain to find them because people harvest them. You can buy candy made from these cacti. Also the fruits, which look like little pineapples in the photo on the left, those are edible and quite tasty. They have crunchy little black seeds inside of them, really yummy. And then the flowers of almost all cacti are edible. And you can see again in this photo, there's an orange-red flower that's opening up at near the top of the photo on top of this cactus. The flesh of cacti are also edible, but then you would have to seriously injure or kill the plant in order to use that. Here's me eating a mesquite bean from that mesquite tree. They actually weren't that tasty. I'm faking like it's good. I just want to say thank you for paying attention to this presentation, and I hope it inspired you to learn about the plants in our region, but do that with care. Bye.